Yeah, we should really start.
Yeah, I think that's
especially on this one.
Which one did you go?
All right, welcome everyone. I don't know if I've met all of you, I don't think so. My name is Amy Raxall, I'm the Executive Director of CHIPTS, and we're very pleased to have you here today to discuss behavioral economics and implications for HIV intervention research. And I think we have a wide array of people in the room, some coming from public health and the economics department, as well as behavioral researchers working with HIV and affiliated directly with CHIPTS. So we have 4 speakers today, and I'm very excited to have them all here. We have first, who's going to start us off, Dr. Tom Rice, who is a distinguished professor at the UCLA Public Health. We have Dr. Arleen Leibowitz, who is the CHIPS Policy Director, and she's also the Professor Emeritus in the Department of Public Health at the School of Public Affairs. And then Dr. Fred Zimmerman, who is the Fred W. and Pamela K. Wasserman Professor and Chair of the Department of Health Policy Management at Fielding. And then we had Dr. Sebastian Lindemeyer from RAND, who is the Associate Director of the RAND Center on Research and Policy International Development. So they bring to us a wide array of experiences and depth of knowledge focusing on health policy. And this field of behavioral economics applied to HIV is something that's been called upon as a need by NIMH and NIH, and there's been a lot of discussion in HHS around the need to bring this research to bear within health policy, but particularly our focus will be HIV. So we know that there will probably be some RFAs and program announcements addressing this topic in the future, and CHIPS is positioning itself to think of behavioral economics as one prong of a 3-pronged strategy moving forward. So the other ones being technology and then combination prevention. So we're very excited to have you here today to discuss some of these issues. And we'll go through a series of presentations, then we'll introduce ourselves just to understand who's in the room, and then have a brainstorming discussion at the end. And I'll be taking some notes, and hopefully this is going to be the seed for some future projects. And many of you know that CHIPS has a pilot grant program. We do it on an annual basis. And this may be, some of the ideas that come out of today's discussion might be perfectly suited to apply for grants. So follow up with me afterwards. Again, thank you. And just a few housekeeping notes, as I mentioned, the keys to the bathrooms are here. You'll need them to get in. We are recording this session, and we'll be editing and posting it on the website, and putting other resources that will be discussed today on that website, and also an announcement after this session. We also will be taking some photos to put on the website, so we may be asking you to sign up for a release or following up with you after this session. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Rice.
Thanks very much, Amy, and I'm excited to be here. I've done some work in behavioral economics, but I haven't done hardly anything with regard to HIV, so I'm very interested in seeing, hearing the discussion and seeing where this can lead to. So what I thought I'd do is talk about what behavioral economics is, and the good way to start is to talk about what it isn't. And what behavioral economics isn't is how economic incentives affect behavior. It sounds like that's what behavioral economics is, but that's what we call regular economics. And for example, if you give someone a financial incentive and they do the thing, like get an injection or take a drug or something like that, that's what we're looking for in regular economics. If you're trying to get people to fill prescriptions and you make a prescription free, that would be something that type of incentive that regular economics would call for. So I think it's important not to confuse an interest in behavior with behavioral economics. Behavioral economics is something more, and it's at the bottom of the slide. It's what I'd say is consistent and predictable deviations from several classical economic assumptions. And these are the 3 that I like to use. Do I point this out? I'm just wondering where to point it. I'm probably just pointing in the wrong direction.
Let's see. It's working a while ago. Oh, it's off. Here. Yeah. Let's do this.
Okay.
Got it.
So keep the that there.
Oh,
And
this
yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So,
Okay.
so,
Okay. So the classical economic assumptions that I like to use are, because they're pretty broad, are 3 of them. The first is that people are hyper-rational. they always make the right decision to enhance their welfare. They know what they want, they see the choices, and they can make the choices that will make them best off. The second one is that they have no trouble sifting through all the information available. More information is a good thing because you can go through all this information and then be able to make the right choice. The third one is that people come into the world with an immutable set of preferences. They know what they want, and they're not going to be unduly influenced by information that comes their way. Now, in their book, so one thing we need to think about is whether we believe this is true, particularly in healthcare. And in their book, Nudge, which I'll talk about later, Thaler and Sunstein, the authors, distinguish between two types of people. And they call the type of people who meet these assumptions econs, and that's short for a term that's actually been around for over a century, Homo Economicus, which is a rational economic man. And so you've got the econs who meet those assumptions, and then they call the people who don't meet these assumptions humans. So we were interested in things like this. Why do people engage in behaviors and activities that they know perfectly well are going to be harming their health? Why don't people take prescription medications even if it's free? If it's free, well, what's going to stop them from doing it? In traditional economics, there would be the time it would take to get to it, maybe some transportation costs, but it wouldn't really explain the fact that only about half of the people take their medications. Why don't people sign up analogously to free health insurance? They get thousands of dollars of benefits. Why aren't they taking advantage of it? And something that I've studied a lot is why would people stick to a health insurance plan that by all measures isn't the best way in which they can spend their money? So those are just an example of the sorts of things we can look at behavioral economics, but probably the most important thing is the last thing, which is what can we do about this sort of thing? How can we improve the behaviors? And when I talk, there's always going to be some sort of a paternalistic edge to it here. The idea is we look at the data and we think that people are not behaving in a manner that's best for them. What can we do about it? So this is a quote that from Nudge that I've always liked. If you look at an economics textbook, you'll learn that Homo Economicus can think like Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, store as much memory as IBM's Big Blue, and exercise the willpower of Mahatma Gandhi. And these are all things that behavioral economics questions, and all economists would question this sort of thing. This is kind of the extreme view of traditional economics. So what I'm going to do now is go through each of these three assumptions of classical economics a little bit more. And this is a slide that my colleague Andrew Barnes made that I really liked. And this was that which are these next two things are people really like? Are they make decisions like Spock, or do they make them like Homer? So let me start with hyper-rationality. And this is the key assumption in microeconomics. A key assumption in microeconomics is called revealed preferences. Revealed preferences says that if you choose something, it had to be best for you, or you would have chosen something else instead. If there's good information out there, then the choices you make reveal your preferences. And by definition, the choice you make is the best thing, or you would have chosen something else. So I think that, to me, this has always been very circular, but it's really the central core of consumer theory in microeconomics. Now, economists believing in this theory have taken this to kind of surprising heights, I think. So here's a quote from Gary Becker, and Kevin Murphy. Becker is a Nobel Prize winner in economics and kind of a superstar in the field. And he once wrote that addictions, even strong ones, are usually rational in the sense of involving forward-looking maximization with stable preferences. So that's what we're sort of fighting for in behavioral economics, a viewpoint that is counter to what you see in a quotation like that. The second assumption I'd mention is people can handle all the information. And I have a quote here from a couple of my colleagues, Roger Feldman and Brian Dowd from the University of Minnesota. And this is in the context of health insurance. They say, if there's an inefficiently low level of information in medical care markets, the solution is to inform consumers, not insure them fully. So let's not worry about the insurance part. The point here is that if you give people the information, they are going to be able to use the information and make the right choices. And There's been questions about this in economics for a long time. In the 1950s, Herbert Simon developed a theory called bounded rationality. And basically, it was that people couldn't sift through all of this information. There's just too much. And you know that by most measures, there's more information now. And so what they have to do instead is come up with other ways to make decisions. And he thought that people used what he called heuristics or rules of thumb, and they so they didn't have to go through everything. And that they often relied on satisficing rather than maximizing. Economics assumes you maximize your utility. In satisficing, you kind of go through your options, say, oh, that one looks decent, and then you choose that one. There is evidence that satisficers are happier than maximizers, but I think it's good that the world has both of them. And the last one I mentioned, the immutable preferences, is that people can benefit from information, but they're never hoodwinked by it. But it seems odd to me because it seems to me a hallmark of a really good advertising campaign would be to change people's preferences, not just to inform them and have them rely on their underlying preferences. And I have a slide here that I think illustrates this. This is from a little while back. This is advertising dollars spent in the year 2000 on 3 products or companies, Vioxx, Pepsi, and Nike. You can see Vioxx, just one prescription drug, was the winner here. But not everyone was a winner. There were over 100,000 cases of serious heart disease that resulted from the use of Vioxx. Merck ended up paying $5 billion in damages. And my point is that a lot of people are using Vioxx not because they really had all these stomach ailments that Vioxx was necessary for, but because of all the advertising for Vioxx. And it turned out that it really was not in their best interest. So I've always been very skeptical of this idea about people having this immutable set of preferences, that we're just giving information so they can realize them. But not all economists are winners, so I have sort of a double prize for you here. 2 Nobel Prize winners, George Stigall and Gary Becker once wrote this. Tastes neither change capriciously nor differ importantly between people. One doesn't argue over tastes for the same reason one doesn't argue over the Rocky Mountains. Both are there, will be there next year too, and are the same for all men. So this is sort of economists kind of making a power play to be the only social science, I think. The only economics matters here. We don't have to worry about the development of tastes, and that's something that other social sciences like psychology do, and of course that's where behavioral economics comes from, sort of a merger of psychology and economics. So here are a few selected insights from behavioral economics, and the other speakers will give you some more of them. The first one is the endowment effect and status quo bias. The idea here is that people kind of think they like what they have. When they come into possession of something, they feel ownership, and it's really hard for them to get something different. So the typical experiment, which has been done many, many times, goes something like this. You have people do a task, and then as you tell them at the end, well, you get a reward for doing this task. Maybe they filled out a survey, and you give half the people a coffee mug, and you give half the people a chocolate bar that costs the same amount. And then you give people an opportunity after that to trade. And it turns out, people who like chocolate bars ought to stick with the chocolate, trade it if they don't, and so on. But it turns out only about 10 to 15% of the people trade. It's because once they come in possession of something, they seem to feel an ownership for it and give it more value than it really has. And I think that if you think about that, you could see how that could lead to other examples that are much more important in terms of people not being willing to move to behaviors or things that would be better for them. One area that I've done research on, I mentioned, was Part D of Medicare. People are not choosing the best policy for themselves. I'll get into that a little bit later. But only 5 to 10% of people are switching plans each year. They have status quo bias. They find their cognitive difficulties in sifting through all the information. So the implication for me on the broadest level is that one thing I want to do is make it easier for people to understand the alternative choices, that the benefits of the alternative choices that they have available. A second one, and behavioral economists love this one, is loss aversion. People have a heightened tendency to avoid losses. People value losses more than gains. They hate losing something more than they like winning something, sort of at a ratio some have found to be 2 to 1. And deductibles are an example like this, is that people don't like deductibles. People probably should have higher deductibles for their auto insurance, for example. And one study found that, of actual data, found that 83% of homeowners paid an extra $100 a year in premiums for a $500 rather than a $1,000 deductible. So they feared this extra $500, even though only 5% had a claim during a year. So the expected value of the extra benefits would be 5% times $500, which is $25. Now, if a person were super risk averse, it might be worth paying $100 to save an expected value of $25, but probably not. People probably are just showing loss aversion here. Some work that Arleen Leibowitz and Kate Desmond and I have been doing lately have looked at HIV Medicare, positive Medicare, Californians on Medicare, and we're finding that they're spending too much on premiums to avoid deductibles. They've got a fear of these deductibles, and that could be some evidence of loss aversion. So my framing implication, I'll talk about framing a little bit later, is that and this sounds sort of bad, or this sounds sort of awful, but maybe what we should be doing is considering focusing on people's losses people might have rather than their gains, kind of scare them out of their bejeevers, so they'll consider doing the behavior that we think is right. Again, I'm sounding paternalistic here. The third one is overly discounting the future, something those of you who've done HIV research are certainly familiar with. People rely too much on what's in front of them, what's salient to them. It's very tempting to eat fatty foods. Those cookies out there are excluded. We're not on the clock here. And not think about the consequences later on. There's an economist in the management school, Shlomo Benartzi, who, along with Thaler of Nudge fame, have done some very interesting work in trying to get people over this. And they have a program called Save for Tomorrow. And the idea is to get Americans to save more for retirement, because Americans save very, very little on average for retirement. So what they did is they came up with this idea, which they claim is being used by most Fortune 500 companies, where you agree in advance that if you get a raise of a certain size, like 3% will go into your retirement savings, and then it'll be matched by the company. And that way you don't have to think about the loss each time, number one, because it's done automatically. And number two, your paycheck's still going up when you get the raise, so you don't think that you have a loss, there. And they found this program has been extremely successful in augmenting retirement savings. And I'm going to let Arleen talk about Kim's study, and there's also a mistake in the last part of that slide. So I'll move on from that, except to say that there's really a huge issue here with HIV, because, I mean, most men presumably would find it more salient, not the enjoyment of not wearing a condom versus thinking about the consequences later on. So you have to think about interventions where there's some benefit that you can be getting now, and that's what I'll be talking about some more as we go on. What the other speakers some of them might be talking about as well. A third implication or thing in behavioral economics is decision fatigue. The idea is that in economics, traditional economics, your choices should be consistent over time, but as the brain gets tired, stressed out, etc., it often doesn't make decisions that are consistent or, by most people's definition, rational. And the coolest study ever is this study that came out a year or two ago by Dan Ziger and colleagues that looked at the behavior of parole judges in Israel. And so they studied parole judges, I think 50 parole judges over like 10 months, and tried to see if a certain factor was responsible for whether they granted parole or not. And this is what they found. This is average over everybody. Apparently the cases came in fairly randomly. In the beginning of the day, about 2/3 of people got parole, and then it dwindled down to 0, and then the judge had a snack, and then a break. And after the snack or break, it went up to about 2/3. It dwindled down to about 10%. Then they had lunch. And then after lunch, they were chirpy, and they about 2/3 granted, 2/3 of the cases were paroled, and then it went down to about 0 by the end of the working day. And these are people's lives involved here, and the judges are well-meaning, and whether this was decision fatigue in this traditional sense, or whether this is just needing some carbs, I don't know. But it is so inconsistent with the idea of consistency in traditional economics. One way in which this has been talked about in our field is in food, is that poorer people have to meet a budget and have to be making decisions about their budget all day long. It can be fairly exhausting. So if in a grocery stores in poor neighborhoods could probably get away with putting some very tempting things near the checkout and having people just tired of making decisions and just sort of snapping these sorts of things up. Last of these I'll mention is too much choice. In the traditional economic theory, choice is always better because it's more likely one of the choices will meet one of the your desires, and also you can just ignore all the bad choices out there, focus on the good ones. In psychology, choice is also generally thought to be motivating, but there's an alternative out there that fits in with behavioral economics, that there can be too much choice. And that if people have too much choice, they might make worse choices, they might be less satisfied with their choices, they might be regretful of the many choices they didn't take. And some research even indicates it can exacerbate depression. So there have been lots of studies done to this, and I'll mention 1/3 of one study. This is the famous jam experiments by Iyengar and Lepper. They actually had 3 experiments in this paper. They looked at jam, they looked at a chocolate experiment, and they looked at an extra credit essays for college students, but this is the one that got the most press. So what happened is a real simple experiment. They went to a fancy grocery store near Palo Alto, and one day they put out a display of 24 jams by the same companies for tasting, and then you get a $1 coupon off. And another day they put out 6 jams, same deal. What they found is that when they put out more jams, more people stopped by to check it out and taste jams. But almost no one bought a jam, only 3%. When they put out 6 jams, 30% of the people bought a jam. And the idea being, how would you know that the jam you bought would be the right jam if there are 24 jams there? So that sort of gives you a feel for it. And as a result, this is the most cited paper in the field. Now, they've done more, you could say, in some ways, practically more important work. They've looked at 1 million people in the Vanguard Fund and their employment, this is the same author, Sethi Iyengar, and they looked at their investment 401ks. And what they found is if the employer gave more plan choices, more ways in which you could invest your 401k, fewer people put money in the 401k, which also they meant they were saving less retirement and they weren't getting the employer match. You can see for every 10 extra fund choices available, participation rates fell by 1.5% to 2%, controlling for variables. So there's a lot of interest in this too much choice. Before getting into some of the tools of behavioral economics, I just wanted to show you one more slide I just came across with by Lowenstein, who's one of the stars in this field, and Doug Howe, who wrote a book in the field. I'll show you at the very end. And this, I thought, was an interesting way I'd never seen of separating behavioral economics from traditional economics. So, as I said in the first slide, behavioral economists and non-behavioral economists both want to influence behavior to improve outcomes. To a traditional economist, improving outcomes just means having them buy the thing that they really wanted. But the way they do it on the top in traditional theory is that you have this choice set on the left. What they do is they use their cognitive evaluation of all the different choices, and they see what are the benefits and costs of each, weigh these things, and then decide on the behavior. In behavioral economics, it's fuzzier in that people have subjective probabilities that might not model the actual probabilities. I won't go into it, but people overvalue low probabilities, and they overemphasize low probabilities and underemphasize high ones, I think. And their feelings are a big part of it. The feelings are affected by some of the things I've talked about, the vividness, the immediacy, their mood, things like that. So all these psychological things go into the decision they make, or the behaviors that they make. So I thought that was a nice, simple conceptual model, sort of distinguishing between the two. So just a few more slides. I want to talk about some common tools in behavioral economics. The most one that behavioral economists like the most are defaults, and most of you are probably familiar with this, and the example is organ donation. The traditional theory is if you want to donate your organs, you'll just decide whether or not to fill out that card in your driver's license, and the choice mechanism doesn't matter, but of course it does matter. If people have to opt out, if it's assumed that they're going to be a donor unless they think otherwise, the donation rates are very high. If they have to opt in, they have to choose to sign up, it's very low. And you can see some places that are, three places that are very close to each other, well, Montana's not very close to Vermont, but you get the idea, is that whether the driver's license has opt-in or opt-out really determines what organ donation rates are, and that wouldn't be the case in traditional economists. So we like thinking about defaults, and that fits into nudges, which I'll talk about in a moment. Framing, I talked about framing before, so here's three ways you could frame. Framing losses rather than gains, which I talked about, sooner rather than later, and making things more vivid, relying on the psychological concept of affect rather than having them more generic or more bland. So I give an example of all three here. Losses rather than gains. If you didn't buy health insurance by March 31st, you pay a penalty and you got nothing. That seems to have stimulated people to buy health insurance even though the penalties are extremely low this year. So that would be an example of that. Sooner rather than later is just let people see the benefits of good health behaviors now. A daily lottery is an example of that, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And the last one, I just couldn't think of what to come up with. I said, put scary stuff on cigarette packages. And I don't know, somebody's probably done a study of that and probably found that it's been effective. Prizes. Prizes seem to work for people because they can get it now for behaviors that will help them later on. So here's one study by Kevin Volpe, who's a superstar in this field. Real small study, 57 people, obese people, with a goal of losing a pound a week for 16 weeks. There's a control group that just got information and monthly weighings. But then you had two other groups. One was the deposit contract financial incentive. They contributed their own money, and if they didn't lose the weight, they lost the money. If they got it back, if they lost the weight, plus the experimenters threw in a pretty penny as well, and they could make $250 a month, or over 16 weeks, about $1,000. And then there was, I can't remember if that's of the same actuarial value, but they had a lottery, daily lottery. If you met your weight goals that day, you had a 20% chance of winning $10 and a 1% chance of winning $100. Both experimental groups lost a lot of weight. The control groups didn't lose much weight. And finally, there's nudges. And so I wanted to show you a couple clips. The first two are from David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK, who established something called the Behavioral Insight Team, which has been called the Nudge Unit, to try to nudge people towards decisions that are in their and the UK's best interest. So I've got two clips from that, and I have one real fun clip that some of you would have seen on YouTube already.
The second thing we believe in going with the grain of human nature. Politics and politicians will only succeed if they actually try and treat with people as they are, rather than as they would like them to be. Now, if you combine this very simple, very conservative thought, go with the grain of human nature, with all the advances in behavioral economics, some of which we're just hearing about, again, I think we can achieve a real increase in well-being, in happiness, in a stronger society, without necessarily having to spend a whole lot more money.
Okay.
I also said the other principle that I think we should work on is understanding of people, is recognizing that going with the grain of human nature, you can achieve so much more. Now, we've got a huge revolution in understanding of why people behave in the way that they do. Having great opportunities to put that knowledge and information to great use. We're working with some of these people, we're being advised by some of these people, as we said, to try and bring all the experience to book. Let me just give you one example that I think is incredibly simple and I love. We want to get people to be more energy efficient. Why? It cuts fuel poverty, it cuts their bills, and it cuts carbon emissions at the same time. How do you do it? Well, we've had government information campaigns over the years where they tell you to switch off the lights when you leave the home. We even had one government minister once told us to brush our teeth in the dark. I don't think they lasted very long. Look at what this does. This is a simple piece of behavioral economics. The best way to get someone to cut their electricity bill is to show them their own spending, to show them what their neighbours are spending, and then show what an energy-conscious neighbour is spending. That sort of behavioral economics can transform people's behaviour in a way that all the bullying and all the information and all the badgering from the government cannot possibly achieve.
Okay. Yeah, that TED Talk is probably the least viewed TED Talk in history, but I love it.
David Cameron.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to give you one example of the last part of this slide. As I mentioned, I don't know if I gave the figure, only 6% of people are choosing the cheapest Medicare drug plan, and this is already taking into account the benefits that they get. So one way you could nudge people, just give you a feel for nudges, is to inform each Medicare beneficiary of how much they would spend on all the 50 or, well, I think it's 30 alternate drug plans that are out there if they use the same drug next year as this year. If you just sent them a letter saying, here would be the best plan for you, you could probably get a lot more than 6% of people choosing the plan that really would be best for them. Kate Desmond and I did a study a while back where we looked at all the choices Medicare beneficiaries face, and a person like me has only like 5 insurance choices, that's all. And this is what we found a Medicare beneficiary had. It's really more complicated than this. You don't go through all of these different trees, but there's a lot more than plans A, B, and C. There's a lot more than extended versus basic drug coverage because the benefits aren't standardized. We're putting seniors through a lot right now, and so I think we really do need to help them out. So my final thought is that behavioral economics is quite good at describing how people behave in ways that aren't predicted by the theory, but it doesn't really matter whether an intervention is a behavioral intervention or whether it's a traditional intervention. What we're looking for is interventions that work. And I think what nice thing about behavioral economics is it opens us up to see other sorts of things that might work that don't fall out of traditional economic theory. So here's some things you might want to think about reading if you're interested in this. The best book, I think, is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He's kind of the father of this stuff. And he's a psychologist, although he won Nobel Prize in economics. And what he does is he kind of combines the literature. He takes all the literature and describes it, but at the same time, he gives his take on it all. It's just a fascinating book. It takes a while to make it through, but it's really wonderful. Nudge, you should consider reading Nudge because that's the book that made the field famous. If you're interested in this too much choice stuff, an incredibly readable book was by Barry Schwartz, The Paradox of Choice. And we now finally have a book just on behavioral economics and healthcare by Douglas Howe, and Rationality in Healthcare. I read it, and it's very good. What he does, he takes about two different 24 anomalies in healthcare and then tries to use behavioral economics to explain it. So, thank you.
Now turn over to Dr. Leibowitz, and I remember there was an anecdote, I think I heard it on NPR, one of the most effective weight loss strategies was to have people commit to putting a photo of themselves nude on the internet if they didn't lose the amount of weight that they
What a
decided
great
for
idea.
themselves. And it worked, it was very effective. Oh, let me give you a pointer. Yeah, we'll hold questions until the end.
Although maybe we should do questions on the basics right now, or you want to hold it off?
I don't care.
Any points of clarification or a question about theory?
A couple. So I'm curious about the role of age. Like the example, I mean, I think you addressed it a little bit about the decision fatigue in a different kind of way. Like your example about the coffee mugs and the chocolate bars, like I couldn't see that with 10-year-olds. I mean, even if they were something else that they liked, I would think the minute they would have the opportunity to switch that they would.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one, and then my other that I didn't see in either theories was the role of like social norms and pressure. I mean, I think sometimes like the escalator example is people are just like with the flow, and their friends are up the escalator, and everybody just goes up the escalator. And I mean, I could think of a million other examples, but
Yeah.
I didn't see
Yeah. In terms of age, I do think that people get stuck as time goes on. I think they get more stuck in their ways, and I think that people have a way of rationalizing whatever they do as the best thing, and it may be that I have this theory that that constructive advice is an oxymoron. That you think you're helping someone, but they're just going to get mad and not going to do anything about it. In terms of the social norms, I might let others talk about that more. Fred's done a lot of work in that area. I don't know if you want to address it now or not.
Maybe I'll wait.
Okay,
That's all right.
yeah. Okay. Uh-huh.
I did have a question. I think one of your slides where you're, I think, listed like the most effective way to for people to make decisions. It kind of made me think about Dr. Jean Richardson and her work, and like based on the Partnership for Health intervention that she developed. Like it was kind of really based on like people's risk levels and what type of messaging would be most effective. And so I think that in her work, it kind of implies that like those that are low risk are more likely to take benefit more from like a more gains type of messaging versus those that are considered high risk benefit more from a loss framing message. And so it just kind of made me think about, whether that should play a role in terms of like where they perceive the benefit and where they perceive the loss, and that would determine.
I think it's a really good point, and I think that that's the one place where pilot studies come in, to try to see what, before you engage in a large intervention, to try to see whether there's certain groups that you want to have different sort of messages come to. But the example you give seems like it rang true when you said it. Kevin?
Tom, it seems back in slide 16 that you compared, when you talked about the insurance rates that people pay, and that we go for the $500 deductible, we pay $100 more a month, that even though you can prove actuarially that that's a fallacy. So you're probably better off $1,000 a year deductible. And then the next slide was about people making their choices about HIV drugs, I believe, or coverage. So what people with HIV choose, the choices they have to face, are very unpredictable in many cases, and I don't think compare effectively with your choice for auto insurance. If I understood you correctly in the slide there. Were you comparing the two or contrasting them, or? I think it's in 16 or 15.
Yeah, no, it was. What I was trying to do in the loss aversion slide, just to explain that people do have a loss aversion, and because they fear some chance of having a big loss, they will do things to avoid it, even if it's not in their best interest. So they would overpay for an insurance that covered too much of the deductible.
With the car or with the health?
That was with the car. In the next slide,
since I was involved in that one, I think there is less uncertainty than you may think in the example that Tom was talking about. Because this is people who are HIV positive on ARVs, so they have a predictable cost that they're looking forward to paying during the year, but they're overpaying for low deductibles and low copays. So it's not behavior that has to do with the risk of.
But the drugs change, their
Infection.
health changes, their age changes.
Yeah, but the structure of the insurance plan in Part D Medicare is such that there's a catastrophic limit, so that in fact your total risk is really capped, pretty much, and people get into that catastrophic part where they're only paying 5% of the drug bill in April, on average. See what I mean? So it doesn't really matter very much whether they get the deductible paid or not, because they have to, the way the plan is structured, you have to spend a certain amount out of pocket before you get into the catastrophic part.
Also, the deductible for the car is only if you have an accident. Deductible
Yeah.
for the insurance, you're gonna have to, for the medical insurance, you're gonna have to pay because you gotta start getting drugs January 1st.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can talk about this later. Dallas had a question, then I think we should need to move
Yeah.
on.
Well, I want to just reinforce Wen's point about the loss versus gain framing. About 10 years ago, there were some articles that came out, and maybe it was HIV specific, but certainly around health education messaging, that talked about gain-based framing might be more effective for a lot of applications.
Okay.
And but this piloting, I think, is a really great suggestion. But I have a colleague at Penn who just got an R01 funded, or is going to be, and they're using gain frame messaging for pesticide, like spraying in households in South America or something like that. But another thing on the framing that I didn't hear about, and I'm just quick, maybe somebody else will address it later, is about fairness. Because those ultimatum game experiments where they give people, you know, the coffee mug, or they can trade and this kind of thing, and they've done some with human interaction, so you're playing this game with another human versus a computer, and people that are playing the game against a computer will accept less disparate kind of deals than if they're playing against a computer, because they're thinking that a computer is just a computer, whereas a person is trying to get something else over them. And then I've been relating this kind of idea of fairness into things like community mobilization campaigns that I've seen, where they're mobilizing based on like social justice kind of framing that says HIV is not about my health. It's, in this one context, it's an occupational hazard. And when people are insisting that you don't use condoms with sex workers, that you don't use condoms, they're violating your rights as a worker and rights as a human being. So I don't know if you've encountered any of that kind of fairness framing stuff in that work that you cited in these
I
books.
have in other contexts, not in the behavioral stuff that I've looked at. So it's good. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. So thank you, Tom, for sort of laying out the landscape here. And I think we've learned a lot of ways in which people make decisions that, from an economist's point of view, would not be considered rational. And so can we, I think I need to do this. Can we use these kind of mistakes in reasoning to our advantage, using a kind of benevolent paternalism to get people to do things that we believe are better for them? So for myopia, one thing would be to give rewards frequently and without delay, because people will discount things in the far future. For framing, it turns out that it matters whether you include your reward as part of a larger thing. So if you want people to take a health assessment and you say, we'll pay you $100 to take your health risk assessment, don't include it as a discount on your health insurance premium, because $100 looks small compared to the rest of your premium. Give it as a special Visa card. And then, as Tom noted, using the right default for choices about retirement accounts. People tend to overweight small probabilities, and so that suggests using lotteries, because people think that they'll be winners. We all think we're winners. And regret aversion, and tell people that too bad you didn't take your medication, because you could have been in this lottery and won had you been adherent. There's optimism bias. People believe that that they're going to be more successful than they are, which is the sort of underlying principle for making a pre-commitment. You know, I commit to do this because you overestimate your ability to achieve the goal, but once you make a commitment, and especially if you put some money on the line, maybe you'll be more likely to meet that commitment. And I think we call those stretch targets. So. And then there's loss aversion. Give people a reward and then say, I'm going to take it away if you don't, rather than saying I'm going to give you something. So let's see how some studies of HIV have used this. This is a kind of summary of research that Kimberly Ling did. Now, Kimberly was a postdoc with Steve Optout, and she really wanted to be here, but she's teaching at this time. So I said I would present her material. So what she did is she did a secondary analysis on a study that had been done to incentivize people who were meth users to stop using meth. And so there was a control, and then there were people who got an incentive if they produced a clean urine sample. So she took the group that received incentives for good behavior, and she looked at people who cashed in their rewards early versus people who cashed them in late. So the early reward takers she called spenders, and the others she called savers, because you could accumulate points. And what she found was that the spenders were much more likely to produce a clean urine sample than the savers. So the theory is that there was substitutability. This early reward was competing with the reward of using the meth. And so taking the reward early seemed really to be important. Now, this is an observational study, and I think very worthy of following up with a more controlled study where you would assign early and late rewards. But I think it's really an interesting study. They also looked for the effect of fun rewards. So the hypothesis was that if you gave fun things rather than utilitarian things, that would be more motivating, but they didn't actually find that was the case. What? Oh, yes. Oh, so you're just saying that it's fungible. So you could take your utilitarian grocery coupon and, trade it for money and go to the movies. There have been a number of studies of using financial incentives.
Going back to that previous slide, they did find a difference between the fun versus the utilitarian rewards among spenders and savers. Is that what it was? Or?
No, they found that both the fun rewards were more effective than no reward, and the utilitarian rewards were more effective than no reward, but they weren't significantly different from each other. But this is a small sample size, and also not a randomized trial. So I think we maybe have to hold off on our judgment on that. So there have been a lot of people who've wanted to use financial incentives to incentivize safe sex. And one study in rural Malawi gave a conditional cash transfer if people remained HIV negative for 1 year. And in the end, at the end of the year, they found there was no significant difference between the group that was rewarded and the controls. So given what we've been talking about, do you see what part of the problem might be with this?
Just a delay.
Yeah, it's too delayed. So the sexual activity is very immediate, and you're saying, in a year I'm going to give you some kind of reward, which probably maybe wasn't that big.
This study was also the one where the men afterwards cashed in their rewards for risky sex, right?
Yeah, there is this unfortunate income effect. But in a different study in Tanzania, they gave the rewards every 4 months, and they actually found some more significant effect. But the study that I really love is the one that was done with girls in Malawi. So there was an observation that girls who had more schooling were less likely to get HIV infected. And so what they did is they gave girls and their parents money every month, plus school fees and school clothing, in order to help them stay in school. And what happened was that after a year, the girls were more likely to be in school and less likely to become infected with HIV. So, and I think the percentages are quite impressive, 2.1% versus 3% for the controls. And it seems to me that the secret of this study is that they were getting a reward every day. Every day that they went to school, they were being rewarded. It was being reinforced. And you were rewarding a behavior that not only was an HIV intervention, but was generally good for the girls. So I think this made the rewards very, very visible. And you didn't have to wait a year to see the effect. So maybe when we're talking about things like adherence to antiretrovirals, we should try really hard to make the results visible in the near term. So I'm thinking about Kate and her Fitbit. So when she was wearing her Fitbit, she really worked hard to hit that 10,000 steps a day. And so if we had a Fitbit for art adherence, that would be interesting. And so I challenge you to think about ways to use that technology. So, and this is an example that's really well known, opt-out versus opt-in testing. So in 2006, the CDC recommended that HIV testing become a routine part of medical care. And at that point, they said there was no longer a need for a specific written consent for an HIV test. And there was no need for pre-test counseling, and for post-test counseling, there only had to be for positives. So this was a big change from the way things used to be, where you had to get a specific written consent to do an HIV test. And I think we've seen some big effects, particularly in the area of testing in pregnancy. So in California, for example, all women must be offered all pregnant women must be offered an HIV test. And in fact, something like 96% of them accept it. So these are early data, but in 8 states with opt-in testing, that is where you were asked, would you like to do an HIV test today? Then testing rates were 25% to 69%. In opt-out states, where the patient would be told, I'm going to do an HIV test unless you object, unless you tell me not to, then the testing rate was 85%. So, and in pregnancy, what happened is that I think that this was really a contributor to perinatal infections dropping dramatically from 2008 to 2011. And you can see a very dramatic effect also, particularly among African Americans. So, so Tom talked about opt-out testing, and they did a study in London hospitals and saw huge increases in testing as a result of having opt-out versus opt-in. And I think that we're mostly doing opt-out now in California. So one thing we talked about was overweighting small probabilities. And Tom spoke to this as well. And this is a study of filling out health risk assessments, employees in a large firm were paid $25 to fill out a risk assessment, and a randomly chosen group were given an additional $25 for filling out the risk assessment. So that would be the traditional economic way of doing things to just increase the incentive. But then another randomly chosen group were told they could enter a lottery if they had completed the health risk assessment, and that they could win $100, but the expected value was 25. So in fact, in an expectational sense, the group that was given an extra 25 was actually equivalent to the lottery group. But 70% of the lottery group filled out the assessment versus only 45% of the directly incentivized.
So is that optimism bias, or that just it's fun to be in a lottery? Or?
I don't know. It doesn't work with me, you know. The NPR says, if you contribute now, you'll be put in a lottery and win an iPad. And I think, yeah, fat chance. But
not everyone has optimism bias.
Right. Some of us are born pessimists. Or maybe some of us know statistics or probability a little better. So this could all be due to a failure of our high schools to teach probability.
God forbid you have to vote.
So what do you mean here when you say the expected value was $100 for the lottery?
Well, so 1/4 of the people would win.
Oh, okay.
So
it wasn't like 1 out of 1,300 people won the lottery. It was
No.
a high value.
No,
Did they post the probability?
Yeah.
1 in 4 will win?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I could see that a little bit more.
Because if it was posted 1 in 4 would win, I would go for the lottery, probably over the direct, but otherwise I would always take.
So you're a risk preferer. You don't want the certain. You don't want the
I want the
certain.
sure thing.
Yeah.
The sure thing.
But if the probability is high enough, you'll be more risk averse.
Right.
Or not risk averse, risk taking.
Right, risk taking. If the odds are good, I'll take the risk, but if the odds are bad, I won't.
Yeah, I mean, I think they should have advertised the odds because I think 1 in 4 is pretty good.
I think they
A
left
lot
out-
better than the iPad on NPR.
Yeah.
Whatever you don't know.
Yeah, they don't tell you the odds on the.
Yeah.
Right.
So one other thing that I want to talk about was commitment devices, because when we were preparing for this, I found I was told about a great website called stick.com. Do you know about Stick? STIKK.com. So this is a website that allows you to make a commitment to a goal. So your goal might be to lose 1 pound a week for the next 10 weeks or something. And to incentivize you, you were allowed to put money on the table to say, I bet $10 that I can lose 1 pound a week for 10 weeks. And you name somebody who's going to be a referee to monitor whether you do this or not. And you name the person or organization that the money will go to if you fail to meet your goal. So the idea is that this uses behavioral economics in several ways. One is that it uses the optimism. You're more likely to think you can do it than you probably are. It uses the loss aversion, because you've put the money up, they've charged your Visa, and you'll lose it if you don't meet your goal. So I personally am going to try this, and we'll see how much money I put up to lose weight.
And if you have to go to the NRA, if you fail, that would be
Yeah, so Kate challenged me, but if your money is going to go to an organization you support, maybe you don't feel so bad about it. Yeah. But maybe if you go to an organization you hate, like the NRA, then you'd really work hard to lose weight. But also there are possibilities for colluding. You could use, if you put up $10, you could give $8 to your monitor to lie for you. But we won't go into that. So I think that there have been a lot of interesting applications in HIV, and And I think we have a lot to learn from other health applications. And Fred is going to tell us about using behavioral economics to incentivize weight loss, which I think has many of the same characteristics as HIV, in that the things you do today have a long-run impact. And so I should say that Fred is a professor of public health and works on obesity.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Arleen. So that's a perfect overview. I'll come to weight loss a little bit at the very end. I don't want to spend too much time on it. Actually, what I want to do is to frame some of these issues in a slightly broader framework and talk a bit about the theory of behavioral economics, which I think it's quite important to understand. So the human brain has sent a man to the moon and back. You all know about the famous challenge issued by President Kennedy. And of course, that challenge was to send a man to the moon, do a little idle rock collecting for a bit, and then come back home, safe and sound. And we met that goal. Now, if you think about it, of course, this was before the age of the modern computer, and being off a little bit, being slightly biased in where that rocket is pointing would result in missing the moon altogether. So there's no room for bias in it. There's really no room at all for any kind of major mistakes. So when we talk about behavioral economics and we talk about these systematic biases, I think it's important to recognize that there are many times when we don't have these biases, that things actually go quite well. Of course, on the other hand, the human brain is also responsible for stranding this poor polar bear on this little tiny ice floe. And I mean, if you've been following the news lately at all on global warming, you can see that this is going to be one of the biggest threats to human health that we've ever faced. And what I think is interesting is that only 44% of Americans believe that climate change is real and is caused by humans. So this is an enormous bias. This is completely incorrect, and it's really a failure to engage with important scientific work that's been done. So, you know, how is it that we have, on the one hand, a brain that is able to solve these incredibly complex problems and do so quite accurately, in terms of sending a man to the moon, and of course there are many other human accomplishments, that's just one. But on the other hand, you know, when it comes to something like climate change, we have terrible biases and we're just very, very wrong. So there are a number of different ways that people have thought about this problem. I mean, one is most economists, you know, who hear about behavioral economics would say, well, that's all well and good for small things. So that's the small change stuff. Yeah, it's true people aren't exactly rational and they don't have stable preferences. Yes, there's stuff like advertising, but that stuff doesn't really matter when it comes to the big things. That when people are making major decisions, they actually do behave, you know, maybe not perfectly rationally, but rationally enough in the big picture. And so what explains it, the difference is that when things matter to people, they are rational. And when they don't matter that much, that's when you see these kind of behavioral or cognitive biases coming in. Another explanation is that there are two kinds of people. There are the rational people, forward-looking, with lots of willpower. And then, of course, there are the people who don't have much willpower, who are irrational, who have these cognitive biases. And so, you know, you can kind of divide the world up into the people who are responsible and rational and the people who are irresponsible and irrational. The third kind of explanation is that we actually have two brains. And Tom mentioned a book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. And the organizing principle of that book, and it's reflected in the title, is that we essentially have two systems in our brain. So he calls them System 1 and System 2. System 1 is said to be intuitive and fast and effortless. System 2 is said to be effortful, deliberative, and analytical. So that we have essentially these two different brains that are, you know, driving these decisions, and that's what explains the difference in outcomes that we see. So I think it's very important to think about what's going on here conceptually, because we get different answers for policy and other things if we think that, depending on which of these things is driving the differences that we see in terms of outcomes. So if it's just a difference in scale, if people are actually right on the big things and they make little mistakes, then it doesn't matter. All this stuff about behavioral economics is kind of trendy now. It's got a lot of academic attention, but in the big picture, it's not going to matter if you think that the main difference is the scale. On the other hand, if you think the main difference is just differences in sort of, I don't know where they come from, but differences in sort of people's quality of decision making, and that is a sentiment that you certainly see reflected in Kahneman's book, then I think it becomes the job of the responsible people to take care of the irresponsible people. And so Dallas?
Yes.
Yeah. So Dallas, brought up this issue, I think, of rights, and so that certainly plays into that. I mean, who has the right to make decisions on behalf of other people, and how do we justify that right? So clearly, if there are two different people, responsible and irresponsible, it makes some ethical sense for the responsible people to make decisions on behalf of the irresponsible ones. I think that's a tough sell. I mean, I would have problems with that. I suspect many of you would as well. But that is a common conception of this distinction between the rational-looking decisions and the irrational decisions. Okay, the two-brain theory tries to get away from that by saying, no, it's kind of like the Solzhenitsyn quote about the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. But this is like the line between rationality and irrationality runs through the brain of every person. But there, the problem is that when you say that deliberative thinking leads to good outcomes, then it must be the case that when there is deliberative thinking, that we've got no problem, we've got nothing to worry about. So I think that there are some problems there as well, because there are many examples when people engage in very deliberative thinking that actually go badly awry. So I think that there's a much better way of thinking about the distinction between rational-looking behavior and irrational behavior. And it starts with the recognition that all thought is based on habit, habits of mind. So let me clarify what that is using this little diagram here. Is there a pointer on this thing or not?
It's the red vertical.
Is it this one?
Yeah.
Okay. So what this is this is a typical rat learning task here, where the rat is trapped down at this end of this little maze, and then the gate opens and the rat runs down here and it hears a tone, and the tone can either be high or low, and depending on whether it's high or low, the rat knows to turn left or turn right, and it will get a reward. Okay, so if it hears the high tone, then it goes down here and it gets a reward here. So obviously the first time the rat encounters this maze, it has no idea what's going on. But over time it learns to associate the high tone with turning left and getting the chocolate that's on this side. And then if it hears the low tone, then it knows to turn right. Okay? So this is brain activity, and as you can see, the red is high brain activity and the green is low brain activity. So what happens is, and these are the number of trials, so how many times the rat has run the maze, and this is not the number of trials, but it's scaled by some factor. So, but so the first few times the rat runs the maze, you can see that it's doing a lot of thinking. When it's here by the gate, it's sort of paying attention, but it's not thinking very hard. When it when it's learning the task, it does all of this thinking at the cue, so the tone, and when it does its turn. That's what it's doing, it's thinking. It's trying to figure out where is that chocolate. Once it's learned the maze, what you can see is that it doesn't actually think at all in the middle here. It thinks here, it's waiting because it's anticipating that this whole task and the chocolate and everything else. But then once the gate opens, it's on autopilot. Okay, so it hears the tone. It just, like I say, it's on autopilot. It knows which way to turn, and it turns that way, and it gets the goal, and then it's here enjoying the chocolate. So a habit then is a series of cognitions that have become chained together, or what this neuroscience is called chunked together. So a habit is something that has a cue, a trigger, and then a set of cognitions, or if you like, a set of behaviors that are linked together in a chain. So that is what a habit is. So a habit is not really something that is repeated, although obviously repetition reinforces a habit. But the habit, in essence, is this group of things that's linked together. Okay, so where do we get these habits? Well, we learn from experience, and you know, there's a lot of stuff that we just learn from our personal experience. You know, if you touch a hot stove, it burns, and that sort of thing. So that establishes this pattern of a cue or a trigger, and then the set of cognitions or set of behaviors. But the other thing is that, of course, we learn from others. And here's some kids who are learning to read, and they're learning, you know, obviously from their parents and from their teachers. In this case, they're also learning from each other. And whatever it is that they're reading, they're also learning something about what's interesting and what's exciting. Okay, so they're sharing this idea of, hey, this is really cool, whatever it is. So I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, but I want to just take a moment and talk about some of the relevance of this to some of the work that's been done in behavioral economics and public health. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I think you guys have probably heard about some of this. But in the specific case of healthy eating, there have been a number of experiments that use stoplights on food packaging or in stores and so forth. And you know, it's just basic, red, yellow, green. Is this food, you know, good, you know, intermediate or bad? Okay, so that actually seems to work. And it works actually much better than nutrition labeling, which is, I think, really interesting. You can put the calories on there, you can put other nutritional information. That has a little bit of an effect, but if you put a red stoplight on there, that has a much larger effect. And you know, obviously, if you put a green stoplight, that has a positive effect. So those kinds of stoplights, you can think about that from a whole behavioral economics standpoint, but I think of it from the learning brain. You see a stoplight, and we've got this cognitive habit now that has a cue and a series of cognitions or behaviors. So you get to a stoplight, you stop at a red light. Okay, so you go into the supermarket, you see a stoplight with a red light on a package of food, you stop. Okay, that isn't to say that you wouldn't think of it and you could potentially take it anyway, but that cognitive habit is interrupted if you do that. And the easier thing is to stick with your cognitive habit of you see the red light and you stop. And obviously with green, it's the converse. Okay, so that's the connection between one, you know, common use of behavioral economics and these kinds of cognitive habits. Another example is visibility. So a cue can be a picture of something or a representation of something, and that is a cue to eat it or consume it. So of course there was a famous experiment done by Brian Wansink where he had on a secretary's desk in an office, there was a container filled with M&Ms or Hershey's Kisses or something, and in you know, one randomized arm, the container was opaque, so you couldn't see what was in it. Everyone knew that there was candy in there because you could look in the top, but the container itself was opaque. And in the other arm, it was transparent, so you could see them. And of course, people took a lot more when it was transparent because the cue or the trigger is there. It's seeing the candies. And then, so Brian Wansink has done who's at Cornell, he's done this the other way too, where both with milk, white milk instead of chocolate milk in schools, and with water in company cafeterias, he places the water very prominently, or the milk as the case may be, very prominently around the cafeteria. And so that, you know, he did this one experiment where, you know, the employee cafeteria, there was water there in 2 locations in 2 coolers, sort of in the corners of the cafeteria. He went in, he put it in baskets, 17 baskets of water all around the cafeteria. Okay, so it was very prominent, you know, impossible to miss. And that experiment bolstered people drinking water by 30%. So this, you know, these have very large effects. But again, the point is that it's triggering this cognitive habit. Okay, so just one more quick example. At Yale University, they wanted to get people just college students to get the flu vaccine. And so they got a bunch of students and they explained the value of the flu vaccine and they got them to make appointments. And then, of course, people missed their appointments. So they're trying to figure out how can we get them to actually go to their appointments. And what they did was they had them not only pick a time and a place to get the flu vaccine, but also commit to a path. How are you going to walk there? You know, your dorm's here, the student health center is over there. How are you going to walk? What are you going to walk past? You know, what time of day is it going to be, and all this kind of stuff. And the idea there is to establish a cognitive habit. You know, people learn more quickly than rats do. So, you know, just by sort of walking through this and visualizing, if you will, it established a cognitive habit. And then, when the time comes around, there's a particular cue or trigger because they had articulated when they would go. And then, of course, they know how to get there. They don't have to think about it. It's like that rat in the maze turning left when they hear the high tone. And that bolstered vaccines very significantly. Okay, so those are just a few of the applications to public health that come to mind from this thinking of the brain as a learning brain, one that's structured around cognitive habits. So there is a bit more to this story. It sort of opens up some really important implications. And again, back to this issue of the rights and kind of who's deciding the nudges, I think is tremendously important. So there was an episode of the Santa Monica schools where they were debating whether or not to retain chocolate milk in the schools, the school board was. And 1,000 parents signed a petition saying, you got to take chocolate milk out. We don't want our kids drinking it. They can drink white milk. And the school board, after hearing all of this testimony and deliberating very, very carefully and thinking about this for a long time, getting a report from the nutritional advisor and so forth, they decided to retain the chocolate milk. So they were making a decision on behalf of all these kids. Their rationale was that there were a lot of kids in the district who were not represented by the parents, who signed this petition, who weren't drinking enough milk. And although they didn't come out and say it explicitly, it was very clear that they were talking about the low-income and minority kids who weren't drinking enough milk, and therefore at risk for all kinds of bone fractures and so forth. And so the school board made a decision to nudge kids to drink milk. Okay, so you have the chocolate milk there, kids like chocolate milk, so they were nudging them into drinking the chocolate milk. So that's a deliberative decision. Now you can agree or disagree with that particular decision, but what I think is interesting about this case is that there's a whole logic that goes into it, and a whole presumption of a right to make a decision on behalf of others, first of all. And second of all, their decision was based on information from the dairy industry, that if you take chocolate milk out, kids won't be drinking milk. And so, their only information was from the dairy industry. Well, that's a bit of a problem because obviously the dairy industry has, some skin in the game. So what is there, why should the dairy industry care if the kids drink skim milk or, with chocolate or not? Turns out that the dairy industry wants people to drink skim milk. And it was the dairy industry that promoted this idea that skim milk leads to weight loss. And they had a problem in the early part of the 20th century because when you manufacture butter or cheese, what are you left with? You're left with skim milk. Okay, that's the milk fat that comes out to make the butter. So then skim milk was a waste product, and they were dumping it in the streams of Wisconsin. And after a while, that became, intolerable environmentally. So they had to do something else with the skim milk. It was a nuisance. And so they marketed it as a weight loss program after World War II. And slowly over time, their marketing became ever more embedded in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it became, part of a kind of public health and agricultural mantra that, we have to have skim milk in the schools. It's not safe for our kids to be drinking whole milk. Although there's never been any evidence at all that whole milk contributes to obesity. So, but this idea, which I would say is like a cognitive habit, that if you drink skim milk because it has the fat taken out of it, you yourself will become skinny. There's no science behind that, but it's a very compelling cognitive habit because it's linking these two ideas together. And it's kind of like in the medieval days, people thought that eating walnuts would make you smart. Why? Because a walnut looks like a brain. So it's the same idea. Skim milk has the fat out of it, so if you drink it, you'll have the fat out of you. No science, but it was compelling enough for policymakers, and then it was pushed by the dairy industry who had a vested interest in doing that. So that's kind of a long story, but the point is that what we know and how we know it can also be subject to the same kinds of behavioral biases that have been identified in behavioral economics and that Tom discussed during his talk. And that affects just the way we think about things in ways that are not random in the population. So my sort of bigger complaint about behavioral economics is that has done a really excellent job identifying the ways in which people's behavior departs from rationality, but those departures are not at random. They happen in particular patterns. So I'm actually going to skip this because this is a study I did, but I've been talking long enough, so let me just skip all this. I want to skip to this. This is a talk that I attended recently by Richard Scheffler from Berkeley, and then with his co-author Stephen Hinshaw, also from Berkeley. And the prescribing for ADHD stimulant medication for kids has increased tenfold or ninefold since 1993. Okay, so think about what that means. Kids are taking stimulants 9 times, at a greater rate than they were 20 years ago. That's a huge, enormous increase. And it's largely due to these kinds of advertising, which has been very aggressive. The sort of experts in child psychology and psychiatrics think that roughly 5 to 6% of kids suffer from ADHD, but on average nationally over 11% are getting medicated for it, so twice as many as really needed. And of course, there are potential long-term consequences that we're only beginning to suspect, and all kinds of dangers of over-medicating kids. But it really does boost school performance. And so it's not just the advertising. There's an additional wrinkle that these two co-authors discovered, which is that so the George Bush spearheaded this No Child Left Behind law, which basically said that, okay, we have failing schools. I know how to deal with that. I'm going to make it illegal. So it became essentially illegal for schools to fail, and the punishment was if they did, they would be closed. So that probably had some. I'm sure he thought he was doing a good thing by that, but the effect of it is to put this incredible pressure on schools to succeed, and therefore on the kids to succeed, because of course the measure of a failing school is all about kids' performance on standardized tests. And one way to improve performance on standardized tests is to give kids stimulants, which do improve academic performance, even when it's not indicated. And so what these guys have found is that in school districts where that were affected by these performance-based indicators, they increased their prescribing of stimulant medications, but only in the schools that were below 200% of the poverty line. So only the schools that were serving the poor kids, which I think is really interesting. And I think the reason is probably that there's kind of a ceiling effect, that kids can be performing pretty well, and as long as they're over the bar, then their schools aren't in any danger of closing. So there's no advantage to doing like super well. You only have to do well enough to pass the bar. And so the schools that were in danger of not passing that bar were the ones that were disproportionately poor. And that's where you saw the big increase in stimulant medication, and it was really huge.
Yeah, Fred, all this stuff is really interesting, but I'm cognizant of the fact that we want to have some time for questions, so if you could wrap it up.
That's it. That's basically it. So just back to this. I think the reason why we have differences in, sort of successful and less successful ways of thinking is because of the kind of political power dynamics that feed into it. Yeah. Okay, so let me turn it over to Sebastian Lindemeyer, who is an economist and a behavioral economist, a health economist, and a development economist who has worked extensively in Africa, and will be talking to us about his work on HIV in Uganda.
Thanks so much, Fred. And I actually nudged my way onto the agenda very last minute, so I don't have any slides, which it turns out is great because mine didn't have cute bears and kids on them. So I see you made good use of behavioral economics for your presentation skills. My name is Sebastian Lindemeyer. I'm an economist at RAND, and I target health issues using behavioral economics, and mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, even though I'm trying to get a little bit out of there due to traveling and my little kids. Arleen invited me to very briefly, because I know that we want to leave time for discussion, so I'll try to limit myself to just a few minutes, to talk about 2 projects that I have going on in Uganda, working with HIV-positive populations. And the first project is uses SMS reminders to improve adherence, and I'm not going to talk about that much because that's more of an mHealth project, which I hear is also of an interest of yours. The second project is also an NIH-funded one, and there I use basically a lottery to incentivize people to come in on the day that they're scheduled to come into the clinic, and the second treatment group is incentivized directly when they show improved adherence. And one thing I just wanted to say that I think is really cool about behavioral economics is that it is a departure from financial or monetary incentives. I think incentives do matter, but in particular in resource-limited settings, behavioral economics are particularly attractive because you don't have to offer these large sums of money. And for example, the VOLP lottery that you mentioned had pretty high payouts in the matter of hundreds of dollars, or a lot of weight loss and smoking cessation lotteries in the US pay several $1,000s often, which we don't have in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think behavioral economics also offers a way to creatively think about what really drives people to make the wrong decisions, and how can we turn it then around to make the same pitfalls, make them use better behaviors. So coming back to this lottery intervention, I'm not aware that anyone has done these sort of lottery interventions for HIV-positive populations in Uganda, and so the first aim of the NIH grant was really just to see if it's acceptable and feasible. And basically, people are enthusiastic, they love it, and they want to win prizes. The prizes in our case are people come in, and if they come in on the right time, which is very easily and inexpensively monitored on their card or from the clinical records, they get to roll a dice, and if they land on a 6, they win a small prize such as an umbrella. So the expected value of the prizes over the course of a year is about $2. It's really, really inexpensive to run these things. And we really also de-stress the monetary prize lottery aspect here. We really tried to fit it into the culture and say, you know, this is something fun. We know it's really hard to take your medication every day. Here's something fun. We value your effort, and you can actually win a small prize, and so, which I think is another thing that I'm very keen on. That and the same with mHealth interventions. So we really have to try to make it work in a particular context and think about the mechanisms why things work, because it can turn around. I was thinking when you said my kids don't want to give up, or they want to have the other kids' toys, right? So there's often kind of countervailing effects that can be triggered one way or the other very easily. So very shortly, what have we found so far? The first result was that we only have data on the first 4 months, but this very simple and inexpensive lottery seems to improve adherence by about 8 to 10 percentage points, from about 75 to about 80-85% in the mean, and it also increases the fraction of people taking 90% or more of the medication. So there's a first indication that this can actually work in a real setting. The second result that I wanted to very briefly share with you, because it sums up a lot of the points that in particular Tom made when he laid out all these different behavioral biases. At the moment, we don't really know which biases work in HIV populations or which are prevalent. So our first goal was just to ask people a lot of questions that get at these biases and sees are people prone to display them? And the answer is very clearly yes. People are extremely over-optimistic. They all think they're not going to fail. They think everybody else is going to fail. They are myopic, so a lot of them want to have the short-term payoff rather than waiting for it long-term. Salience matters, medical literacy matters. So we found a lot of these biases. And the second question is, how do these biases that clearly exist, how do they translate into adherence or problems with adherence? And that's what Chad, who I wanted to introduce here, he's a grad student here at UCLA at the Econ department, that we're currently investigating, and it seems that some of these matter more than others. And I think that's one of the pitfalls of behavioral economics. It's such a monstrosity, such an amorphous, there are so many biases, and everybody tries to find another bias and coin another term, peanut bias and all these sort of things. So it's really hard to tell what's really the important ones, and we really have to think about also more about the mechanisms, which is something that NIH and NIMH, as you mentioned, is increasingly asking us. Don't just throw prices at people, find out why they work, right? So we're trying to test out kind of which ones are the ones that matter, and I hope to keep you posted on that with hopefully a publication we're going to do very soon, right, Chet? So I'm going to end with this. I don't have slides, as I said, but I have some cards if someone wants to have a longer chat, and we still have 20 minutes or something like that for discussion.
Yeah,
so thanks very much for giving me the chance.
Yeah, so we thought that one very useful thing to do would be to think about how behavioral economics could be incorporated into your work. So to accomplish that, we thought maybe we'd go around the room, if you could just say a little bit about what you're working on, and then if that triggers some thoughts for people about how we might incorporate behavioral economics, that would be really useful. Does that sound like a good idea?
Do you have some questions before we start?
Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry.
So I just had I guess 2 points that I wanted to get your answers on, all the presenters. So I know that behavioral economics is looking at rationality and how people make choices, but it seems like there's no definition, like what is rationality exactly, and like what are the standards of rationality? And if you don't have that, right, I feel like we tippy-toe around the, who gets to decide, who gets to nudge, and people are making these mistakes in reasoning, and it's like they are mistakes in reasoning, right? They're not going to fool you into giving money to KPCC, on lottery for an iPod, right? Because you're not making that kind of mistake. It also seems to me that what behavioral economics is doing is taking a time slice view of rationality. So it's kind of like how people are reasoning now, today, at this moment, and what habits they bring to the table. But it seems like there's so much more involved, right? So I mean, different people reason differently depending on your education level. It's a habit of the mind. People are going to have different habits. Some better reasoners than others, right? And your rationality develops in context or within family, within relationships. And I feel like all that story is missing. And by the time it comes to an intervention, or we get to adults who are obese or have diabetes or don't want to wear condoms, it's kind of too late, right? Because the whole rationality comes from way back when that should have been developing along, just as any other capacities that we have. And so kind of looking at rationality as a kind of capacity, as a whole human capacity just seems to be missing. And not to mention like emotions, like for some, we should think of in a very cartoonish view as emotions as just sort of opposing reason, right? But there's so much work on emotions, looking at them as value judgments, right? As having a cognitive component, and that's also part of rationality and habitual actions. So I'm just curious to know, like, how can behavioral economics bring all that in, right, to really flesh out what's happening with rationality and really get to the meat and potatoes of it?
Yeah, I think in a way, all of us who talked are economists, and we have a certain mindset. And in that mindset, what counts is a sort of a financial calculus. So we would say that you chose chose not to get the auto insurance policy with the lower deductible if you calculated what's my probability of having an accident, what's my expected payout if I have an accident, and how does that relate to the increased premium under these two different deductible plans. That would be rational. You're making a decision based on money. And what you described is sort of the non-economist view that there's all this other stuff going on. And maybe it's only a surprise to economists that our model doesn't work. But I think that what's happening is that we're trying more systematically to explore why that model doesn't work. And I think that there's some really interesting evidence, and like Sebastian's study, you would think that people who are being given medication that's going to improve their health and increase their lifespan, and they probably don't have to pay for it at all, right? That surely you would take that medication. If someone was going to give you medication that would extend your life and prevent illness, wouldn't you take it? But no, because there's all this other stuff. You're busy or competing challenges, and so if you can kind of make it more attractive in some way to take the medication, we're engaging again in benevolent paternalism. But I think if you asked people, would you like to extend your life, they
Yeah.
would say yes.
But I think that's a perfect example of, kind of what I mean. So in your slides, you have the example of the girls in Malawi who were being given money to stay in school, and that was the 1.2% versus 3% infection rates at the end of the year. I felt like what was different about that example was she wasn't acting alone. It was her and her family, right? So there's all this web of reasonings and motivations that's in place when this is happening. And I know so I think if the experiment had been run differently, if they had say, hey little girl, we're gonna give you and only you some money, right? Sounds bad. We're gonna give you some money for staying in school. We're gonna give you money for staying in school. Nothing really goes to your parents, or we're not even talking about parents, or other family. That, I would guess that it would be that the outcomes would have been very different. And I know that other adherence studies in sub-Saharan Africa, and I can't remember who it was, also look at involving everyone in the person's community, right, to kind of help them to get to the doctor's appointment or get to their meds, et cetera. So that's this huge impact on reasoning alone, right? That's going on. That when we only look at an individual, we kind of I don't know.
Yeah, I think your points. I agree with your point, but I think that there is a reason for it, and that's that regular economics is over 200 years old now, and we've had an awful lot of time to really hone the theory. Behavioral economics is, I don't know, let's call it 20 years old. It's hard to say how old it is, and what we're still doing is revising the theory based on some of the evidence that we're putting together. So I think that the lack of a really unifying theory and our inability up to now to really figure out which factors to take into account in decision making it's because the science is so new.
I think it's also because as economists we're on the one hand trained to think in atomistic individual terms, and on the other hand because behavioral economics is new, you want to test out this one prediction basically. But of course, maybe it would be even more effective if you did it on the whole community. So I'm thinking, for example, the opt-in, opt-out. When you're sitting at the DMV, do you opt-in or out of organization? But of course, there have been studies where people find that if you say 90% of your friends donate their organs, then that even amplifies that. So I see behavioral economics often as kind of a much more complementary to existing interventions than substitutes.
And I don't mean to be critical, by the way. Just I appreciate this conversation. I just find it really, it's really interesting. So,
can I ask how life expectancy fits into this analysis? Because for some of these things that you're talking about, like if you're in a developing country, their life expectancy might not be as long. Or I'm thinking about even here in the U.S. if you're talking about, let's say, African American males, where they might have a lower life expectancy, and so therefore they're not as future oriented. And so, how does that fit into the?
Where does survival play into all of this? Kind of thing.
Well, it's not survival, but it's just changing
Your concept of risk.
Yeah, it's changing your concept of risk
and your horizon.
Exactly, it's changing your horizon, and so. It's something that you're looking at as irrational behavior is in fact given there, and I think that's part of your point, given the particular circumstances might actually be rational. So I'm sort of curious about that. And then I was thinking in terms of the and this is just something I was just thinking about as you all were presenting. Could you think when you were thinking about the decision, your point to the social justice about having a woman, a sex worker, say, well, it's my right to, it's protection for me as a worker for the man to wear a condom. How does the difference in risk and transmission play into that for the man versus the woman in terms of the choice to wear a condom, because if I understand correctly, men have it, and depending on whether it's heterosexual or not sex, there's a difference in transmission rate, right? Between, so how would that type of thing fit into this? Where I guess what I'm saying is where it might be rational for the man not to insist on putting a condom on because he has a different risk of transmission, let's say in like heterosexual sex, versus the woman, it's more in her, so it's sort of like an externality, right? And so the man is only thinking about his particular, you know, what's his
risk acquisition.
Exactly,
basically.
exactly. So,
Competing interests.
right. So I had some of those questions as you all were presenting.
And the flip side to the risk perception is also reward perception. I was thinking about that graphic you had of the brain activity in the mouse, and halfway through, I know it's weighted, but you know, there's a red spot when the reward was received, but then at the bottom corner, it was yellow. So there's less, you know, like saliency really around the reward. And I'm wondering if that's something to consider as we're developing interventions. Do we need to stagger the rewards, change the rewards, give rewards? Obviously, rewards mean different things to different people, but does that change over time in intra-individual?
You know, I think that Steve Shoptaw and probably others have found that increasing rewards on contingency payments is more effective than having a constant reward. But, I mean, that also raises questions about these incentive payments to change behavior, because how long are you going to keep up the incentive, what you would like to do, and I think has not been very well substantiated in the literature, is you'd like to create habits so that people persevere in their habits even when you take away their reward. And I think that there's not much evidence for that.
I mean,
That people tend to slip back.
Yeah, so most of the current interventions, including the VOLP study with the warfarin lottery, people revert back to their beginning risk levels. And there's certainly more work that's needed on how to sustain these. And my personal opinion is that it has to be a mix of behavioral economics and more traditional interventions. For example, I think behavioral economics is can be very, very effective at beginning phases. For example, when you start taking your HIV medication, you know, pay people or enter them in a lottery to get them used to taking your drugs or to showing up until they get to know their provider, and then you do more support studies once they know the patients in the clinic, these sort of things. That's why I said I think there's complementarities. And I think on your point with the life expectancy, I think in a way behavioral economics is good news for poor people. Because from a traditional economics sense, if someone has a short planning horizon, would have to pay them a lot of money to not engage in those behaviors that give that person pleasure right now. But behavioral economics says you don't have to pay the full amount, you just have to trigger them enough to change the behaviors. In that sense, I said, I think in Sub-Saharan Africa it's very useful in terms of sustainability, and you can think about the same in
so there's sort of like short-term, I was sort of thinking about that. Is it like a short-term solution? Because I was also thinking about Heckman's work on the non-cognitive skill development, and how he's finding that in terms of like some of these pro-social behaviors like employment and education. You know, it relates very well. I mean, it relates a lot to what I think is. I was wondering how those two, if those two are being connected at all, because he is actually talking about these soft skills, which I think is, to me, sounds like it's at the heart of some of these things in terms of adherence. They're things that you learn to follow through, right? Because isn't that part of it? I could be wrong, but
it's part of growing up.
Huh?
It's part of growing up. You learn some skills like
these
pleasure
are the
delay,
soft skills that you might
pleasure
learn
management.
from your parents, and so I'm just curious as to how those, if there's anything connecting those two, or because I don't think he necessarily considers himself a behavioral economist, right? So.
Well, I'm just like wondering, because I mean, I think this ties into a couple of the different points, but how much is there a way to apply behavioral economics to emotional regulation, like in concert with the cognitive piece? Because I think for a lot of the risk behavior that we're trying to stem, there's a big emotional component that drives a lot of like impulsive decisions, or not even necessarily impulsive, just like long-term, what we would consider risky decision making. So how do you kind of incentivize people to not only think differently or think in ways that might be more protective for themselves, but also take a moment to arrive to be able to think, to make decisions, like whether they are feeling very angry or very romantic or very whatever, that part is also somehow not curbed, because I don't think you can necessarily curb emotion, but can you somehow tailor that piece or modulate that piece so that you can reach the cognitive piece that I think you're trying to hit and trying to make more habit forming in a more positive way. And I think what's positive, what's regulated, what's modulated is all very subjective. So I think that's a lot of you guys have touched on the paternalistic and the how do you decide what that is. But if you're going to decide, like how do you kind of figure out the emotional aspect, and can you even apply some of these techniques to that piece, as well as you're trying to make the cognitive or behavioral changes that might be the down, kind of like the outcome that you're trying to improve.
Yeah, what you're talking about kind of puts me in mind of Kahneman, who his thinking fast and thinking slow. The thinking fast is kind of the intuitive part of our brain that Neanderthals used to run away from a bear. But the were there bears? Yeah. And the thinking slow is the kind of rational type, kind of deliberative process. And I've seen that there are now interventions with kids to get them to kind of slow down and to not react instinctively, like not to lash out, but to say when someone says something really outrageous to you, to count to 10, and then frame your response. And I suppose that I don't know whether that training works, but that I guess would be something that you could do. But it's really hard, I think, in HIV when a lot of the actions that we want to change have to do with sex, and it's such an attractive stimulant that it's really hard. I mean, I think that maybe things like adherence are easier to intervene in behavioral economics with.
I mean, I've thought on the way here because I'm dabbling mostly in adherence, but for me adherence is really kind of a broad concept. It's adherence to healthy behavior, and a healthy behavior is also using condoms, so prevention in that sense is also adherence. I think one of the big problems with prevention is that sexual activity is such a hard thing to measure. Because one of the things that I have a much easier time with is I'm using MEMS caps in my interventions, so you can clearly see when that person opens his pillbox, but it's much harder to establish whether someone has sex, because you want to establish, in the end, you want to in real time incentivize not engaging in that one unprotected action, and that's all all it takes, basically. And I was talking with Alex Carvalho of Columbia. We had an mHealth workshop here a while ago, and we were actually thinking of how to develop sensors to measure sexual activity, but I think that's just, one part of it is just a measurement issue.
But actually, when Fred talked about habit formation, I think that's been a basic part of a lot of these behavioral interventions, to rehearse how you're going to negotiate condoms, or rehearse how you're going to disclose. And that once you've done that, then it's easier to follow through.
Right. The underlying assumption with part of it with the rehearsal is that when you get into the situation where you have an increased arousal, and I mean a cognitive arousal, but also a sexual arousal, but it's the same, that the rehearsal allows you to have that heightened level of arousal have less of an impact on your ability to implement your rationally driven goals to practice safe sex or take your medications. I think back to your point, there's I think an intersection of behavioral economics with affective neuroscience. And I don't know, we don't have any probably affective neuroscientists here, but there's a bunch of people that are studying the effect of emotion and arousal on behaviors and decision making, and I think we're kind of seeing this converging somewhat with behavioral economics. And I know that some of our HIV prevention interventions are really based on, we use these tools to count to 10 or relax to decrease arousal, and it's really clearly linked to then being able to think more clearly, in other words, using your rational cognitive capacity to then make your decision, and your rehearsal is your behavioral capacity to follow through on that rational piece. So we have this feel, think, do cycle that we apply in our interventions with Mary Jane.
Talking about the challenges of dealing with HIV prevention, it sounds tremendously like the challenge you deal with people who are trying to recover from addiction. What you're talking about here is like
hits on a lot of the same things you hit in a cognitive behavioral therapy with addiction. I mean, it's the same situation because you're exposed to a desired stimulus, and you have two paths forward, and you're trying to train people how to make the right choice, how to make a choice that generally better conforms their long-term interests in the face of something that's extraordinarily tempting.
Yeah.
So to touch a little bit on the emotional part of this, and you talk about sexual activity, one of the populations that I work with are the transgender community, and when sexual activity relates to validation, then that's another layer that's going to be put in there.
No solutions yet.
Well, I think there's this whole other piece, and I think you touched on this, right? Just thinking about learning from what businesses have, the knowledge they've accumulated over the years in terms of marketing effectively, and thinking about PrEP as an intervention. We know that if you adhere, it's going to be highly efficacious. But then we move into the challenges people have with maintaining the regimen. So is there a purple pill for PrEP? Is there a way to brand something like a PrEP that would be appealing, effective, and make people feel like they want to adhere because of the marketing that's associated with it? There's a whole range of opportunities there.
Should it be a green pill?
Yeah. How do you go?
The marketing stuff has come up in higher conversations in this room, actually, in particular around the pharmaceutical marketing of antiretroviral treatments and the projection of images of being healthy and strong when you're HIV positive. And so that really, and there's a challenge there because for people who are positive, those are great messages, right? You really want to kind of promote that positive image. But for negatives who are at risk, we're kind of at a loss of what kind of messaging we can do, because if we put out a bunch of fear-based negative messaging like we had in the early stages of the epidemic with people, wasting away, like that will then enhance stigma for positives significantly. So you don't want to have bus signs with like people, dying of AIDS, and it's probably unrealistic in these days, but still when you're not adhering, that's what would happen. So how do you, this is another big challenge, is how can you sort of change the overall framing of what a health behavior is in a community that impacts things like cues and social support, and also your own general perception of what your choices are and how it affects you emotionally, without increasing stigma for some populations versus others.
There's another wrinkle too. If you put out very positive images of what a healthy person with HIV looks like, then you communicate to HIV negative people that it's no big deal.
That's right, exactly, yeah.
And so, market segmentation.
Yeah, market segmentation. Yeah.
So I think, like, for me, just hearing what you were saying, like the bottom line is self-value, and that's something that we have to focus on. Because I work at the Red Circle Project at UCLA Health and Wellness, and I run a Native American HIV prevention program. And a lot of Native Americans really have this value that is tied in with their community, with their family. And I walked in on Omero's, what you were talking about the girls in Malawi. It just felt like there was a burden attached to them because they were being incentivized, or their parents were being incentivized. And I think even with the trans community, there's a lot of an emotional sort of disconnect and or strengthening a self-love that has to be present. And I think that in a lot of the, I guess, social media that's out there, it's about the life and not necessarily about yourself.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It goes back again to like what different cultures value is important, right? We have a lot of value in the U.S. and Western cultures. Non-indigenous Western cultures is maybe the better way of saying it. There's a lot of value on individual benefit. And for a lot of communities that have different values, then those messages aren't going to seem right, and maybe people's responses won't seem rational. It doesn't mean that they're not exactly rational. They may have other benefits that they see in their communities or for themselves. I had a question about this concept. You gave your skim milk story was fascinating to me, and it actually reminded me of going back to the loss versus the gain framed messages. feel like early in my public health career as a student, I learned at some point that negative messages are bad. You shouldn't tell people to be afraid of something, that that's not a good way to change behavior. But I've seen a lot of research since then that seems to not support that, and I'm wondering, was that ever true, or is it kind of like skim milk that we at some point were fed that line from one study or something that it's not really the case?
I don't know, I think that's a really interesting question, and I've tried to look at the literature and I haven't come to any conclusion about that, in terms of generally whether it's better to motivate people using negative ideas and a negative frame versus a positive
It's
one.
the only way to win an election, you know.
Yeah. Well, no, but it depends on who's, like, even there, it's really complex, because if, you know,
if you're in the
that's the role of the vice president, right? Because if you're one day you actually lose popularity as well, so, I mean.
Yes,
That's true, but it certainly doesn't seem like there's a weight of evidence saying that negative messages are bad for changing behavior, as which was essentially what I learned as a public health student somewhere along the line. And just
No, I mean, I think there are ethical issues. I mean, obviously,
Yes.
like we were talking about, you want to avoid stigma. I mean, certainly in the case of healthy eating issues, that's a real problem. That, you know, you don't want to stigmatize people based on how their bodies look.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a definite problem.
There was a review of gain and loss frame messaging of like mass media campaigns for HIV prevention. And that was about 10 years ago or so, and I can't remember the name of the author. But what they kind of concluded was that if you're in a high prevalence area, like 30%, and you're seeing and knowing people are becoming HIV infected, that loss frame messaging is very powerful, and it works, because you have a direct experience of what the loss framing is about. But in low prevalence areas, loss framing isn't effective because you're hearing all these risk messages, but you don't have any direct personal experience with anybody who's had a loss associated with an HIV infection. And I think intuitively that somehow might relate to like maybe a status quo issue. I'm not sure, but certainly related to kind of the personal risk experience.
But there certainly is a difference between loss and negative. I don't think loss has to be negative. And also another flippant answer is it really, I think there's also a middle way, or sometimes it's not hard to tell what is a gain and what is a loss in those deductible gains that they do in companies. Sometimes they increase your overall deductible, but give you the opportunity of winning part of it back if you don't smoke, if you lose weight, these sort of things. So then it's not clear exactly what is a gain and what is a loss.
Yeah, actually I should clarify.
It's really about the endowment effect and the loss aversion. You should really think about
the
it.
endowment effect and loss aversion. And I think I should clarify that paper was probably looking at fear-based messages versus non-fear-based messages, and they tied it to loss and gain framing.
I just wanted to say, like, I mean, I thank you for all the presentation. I thought that was really fascinating, and I wanted to kind of tie in to a couple of things that Dr. Rice and
Fred Zimmerman.
Dr. Zimmerman, in terms of what you had said, because I was thinking about kind of applying to kind of with ACA and like getting people to be enrolled and like the right health plans and so forth. And I think that you mentioned in one of your slides about like if someone was to recommend the best plan for someone, and would that actually increase enrollment? And so I think it would actually kind of depend on who's delivering that message, you know, in terms of whether it was someone from a reliable source or someone that they kind of trust in terms of that professional opinion. And the second would actually be in terms of like, I wonder if it would vary in terms of the number of options that is being provided. Given the jam example that you had, whether it would be best to kind of offer one jam or one health care plan to someone if that's the best plan, or whether to offer the three best plans to them and then allowing the patient or the client to choose between three versus actually exposing them to like the 20 plans that are available to them, you know, whether the overload of information would prevent them from even making a decision, but if it was narrowed down to like three plans that are like a little bit more, you know, where people can actually process the information and actually be able to compare and then actually ultimately making the right decisions for themselves, you know. So I wonder if it would kind of vary again in terms of who's delivering and whether the number of options would actually.
Ask the Canadians.
I think both of them matter. We wrote some colleagues and I wrote a paper where we proposed the the way to make it easier for Medicare beneficiaries to choose a drug plan would be to have the government agency winnow down the number of choices to a handful. But the problem gets to be the first part of what you said, is who does the winnowing? And the idea of the government, Medicare, deciding which plans get to be in the finalists is something that politically really is impossible.
Right,
I agree.
right.
I think the more likely thing is not say what the best plan is, would be say this would be the cheapest plan if you chose that. But people do like it. People do like to have a choice. And
Yeah.
I think one is not really a choice.
Because I think that, like, just kind of thinking about how I chose my health plan, like I was on HealthNet for a long period of time, and it was just mainly out of laziness that I didn't want to really like change the plan. I'm just being completely honest, and it was just like, oh, I don't have time to review all these like 6 plans that was offered to us. But then, you know, thanks to Kathy Reback, who I was just kind of chatting, you know, she happened to mention like, oh, she's on this other health plan, and you know, actually you can save like, you know, $200. And then I spoke to another good friend of mine who had a different plan, and basically between the two people, you know, who I both trust, for the fact that it narrowed it down to 3 options for me, I actually went in and kind of read the 3, and then I just made a decision in terms of what was the best plan for me.
There's a study I'm involved in now. It's kind of interesting. It's there could be HIV applications, but it has to do with every time you work, a company's working for people working for a certain company. When they get a prescription or when they get a doctor's visit, they get an email that says, if you made this choice, you would have saved this much money. And we're analyzing whether that sort of messaging would be helpful in convincing people to consider alternatives.
After the fact? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, would it be better before the fact?
No, well, it depends. If it's a one-time thing, sure. But in terms of like ordering a drug, if you have a chronic illness, you know, that would be the first of many times. Going to a particular doctor, you'll say if you went to this doctor, you would save this much money, and you'd be going back to the doctor. So, yeah, if it's a recurrent thing, you know, it could make a difference.
Well, it's loss and gain if it's a recurring thing, because you see that you had loss, but there's potential for gain.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, this is being. I can't remember how the message is being sent. Like, you blew this much money. Or
Yeah. Well, I made my
Sucker.
I'm like, I was going to save $200. I was like, oh wow, you know. So.
But actually, you did exactly what Tom was suggesting. You let other people do the analysis for you that these were superior plans,
Right.
and then you checked it out. But it narrowed the field for you.
Right.
But you
That's
probably
right.
would have been
Reduced
better off
cognitive-
if you had been able to state your preferences, like if you care about wait times or about monetary expenses or health risks, and then someone would have sent you all 6 plans ranked by those criteria. It would probably
Right.
have been
Right.
optimal relative to
Yeah.
what you did.
Actually,
right?
we
So
do
and
get that.
that's-
At open enrollment, we get the satisfaction scores.
But you don't get for your specific, you have
Right.
taken last year these drugs and you have waited
Oh,
3
no.
hours. If you take that, you would
Exactly.
have waited 2
Yeah.
hours.